He was driving his Audi, eating a biscuit, thinking it was just an ordinary afternoon. But when the siren went off, everything changed in an instant. The reason? The color of his skin. Even with valid papers, they still doubted him. When his daughter started recording the incident, things escalated. A small mistake could change everything, and he had no idea what would happen next. Curious about the outcome? Keep watching to see how it all unfolds. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share this with your friends. This is a story everyone needs to hear. It was a normal Thursday afternoon. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the street. Marcus was cruising down the highway in his Audi, a car he had worked hard for. The hum of the engine and the soft click of the turn signal were the only sounds that accompanied him as he nibbled on a biscuit, savoring the simple moment. He was heading home, thinking about his kids, his wife, and the peace he'd find once he was back. His daughter, Ava, was in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, while his son, little Eli, was in the back seat, blissfully asleep. Marcus smiled to himself. It wasn't often that they had this much time together, but today everything seemed calm. Just another afternoon like any other. But as he approached the intersection, a flash of red and blue lights broke the silence, and a loud siren pierced through the air. Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing the squad car pulling up behind him. Confusion crossed his mind. Why was he being pulled over? His papers were in order. Everything was legit. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. As the officer stepped out of the patrol car, Marcus quickly checked the rearview mirror again, his heart starting to beat a little faster. The cop, a heavy-set man, slowly made his way to the driver's side, his hand resting on his belt where his gun was clipped. Marcus's pulse quickened. Something about the officer's posture, aggressive and stiff, made his stomach drop. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said gruffly, shining a flashlight into Marcus's face, his eyes narrowing. "License and registration." Marcus, still confused, reached into the glove compartment and handed over his papers, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Here you go, officer. Everything's in order," he said, trying to sound calm. The officer glanced at the documents but didn't immediately hand them back. "Step out of the car, please," he said, his tone suddenly more serious. Marcus frowned. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I have all my papers right here. There's no reason to—" "I said step out of the car," the officer interrupted, his voice growing louder. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but something in the officer's stance made him think twice. He slowly opened the door and got out, trying to keep his movements slow and steady. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew that arguing wasn't going to make things better. As he stood beside his car, the officer moved closer, now eyeing him more closely, his hand twitching near his holster. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was this really happening? Just a routine stop turned into something different. Marcus stood there trying to keep his cool. He had been pulled over plenty of times before, but this didn't feel right. The officer's eyes scanned him like he was some kind of threat, and there was no reason for it. He kept telling himself to stay calm. Don't make things worse. But his nerves were starting to fray. "Everything okay, officer?" Marcus asked, trying to sound confident. But there was a tremor in his voice that he couldn't hide. His daughter, Ava, sensing the tension, looked over at him from the passenger seat. Her brow furrowed and she could see something wasn't right. Marcus caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod, though inside he wasn't sure what was happening anymore. The officer didn't respond immediately. He just kept staring at Marcus, his hand still hovering over his belt. It felt like an eternity before the officer finally spoke. "Your papers are fine," the officer said, holding up Marcus's registration and license. "But I've got reason to believe these are forged." Marcus's chest tightened. "What?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. "There's no way. I've had these papers for years. They're legit." The officer stepped even closer, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "I said get out of the car," he repeated, his voice now low and cold. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's heart raced. He glanced back at the car. Ava's wide eyes locked onto his. He could see her hand gripping the phone in her lap, and she was already pulling it up, pointing it in his direction. The officer's gaze flicked to Ava, and suddenly his stance shifted. He seemed more agitated now, his hand hovering near his gun. "I said," he started, but Marcus quickly stepped in. "Please don't," he said, taking a step back, trying to diffuse the tension. "My daughter's just recording because I don't know what's going on. I'm just trying to figure this out with you." The officer didn't like that. "Give me your phone," he demanded, taking a step toward Ava. "Leave her alone," Marcus snapped, his body tensing. "She's just recording. She's not doing anything wrong." But Ava, despite her father's warning, opened the door. "Dad, I'm just trying to show what's happening," she said, voice trembling. The officer reached for her phone, his grip tight, and for a moment, Marcus felt the air thicken. He saw his daughter, not understanding the danger, standing her ground. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the back seat, little Eli stirred. His small voice broke through the tension. "Daddy?" he said groggily, his eyes still half closed, his innocent voice like a knife to Marcus's heart. And then Marcus saw it. The officer was now turning toward the back of the car. Slowly his hand slipped toward his weapon, and Marcus's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The officer was aiming the gun at his son. "No!" Marcus shouted, his heart leaping into his throat. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. "Please, don't shoot my son." He ran toward the back of the car, his hands raised, as though that would stop the officer from pulling the trigger. In that instant, everything seemed to freeze. The world around him blurred. His mind was racing. This can't be happening. This can't be real. He wasn't sure how to handle it, but the words came out before he could stop them. "My wife is a cop," Marcus blurted out, his voice desperate. "She's a police inspector. Her badge number is—" He quickly rattled off his wife's badge number, hoping, praying that it would be enough. It wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. It was about making sure they survived the moment, that the officer, who still had the gun trained on his son, didn't pull the trigger. The officer's hand hesitated over his gun, and for a split second, the air felt still. Too still. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, each beat sounding louder than the last. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding before him. All he wanted was to protect his family, but at that moment, he was starting to feel powerless. The officer's eyes flicked between Marcus and the small boy in the back seat, still half asleep, confused by the chaos around him. Marcus stood there pleading with everything he had left. "Please, don't shoot him. Don't shoot my son." The desperation in his voice cracked as he spoke the words. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about keeping his family safe, about stopping the nightmare from becoming a reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer's hand dropped from his gun. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but it lessened just enough for Marcus to breathe again. The officer looked down at the ground for a moment, then back at Marcus with a cold, calculating stare. "You're lucky," the officer muttered, almost as if to himself. "You think you're some kind of big shot, huh? Thinking your wife's badge is going to get you out of this." Marcus's blood ran cold at the officer's words. The threat was subtle, but it was there. It was clear the officer wasn't going to back down, not without trying to make Marcus feel small. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen, not with his family watching. "My wife's a police inspector," Marcus repeated, his voice now steady. "Her badge number is XXX. Look it up if you need to, but I'm not the one you want to mess with." The words came out stronger than he'd expected, but it wasn't just for the officer. It was for his wife, his kids, for every moment they'd had to fight to survive, to exist without fear. There was a long pause, and Marcus thought the officer might respond with more anger. But instead, the officer did something unexpected. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping, as if a weight had suddenly been lifted off him. "You're right," the officer grumbled, pulling Marcus's documents from his belt and handing them back to him. "This was a misunderstanding." His voice was laced with irritation, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes now. He realized he'd made a mistake, one that could have cost him everything. With a final glance at Marcus, the officer turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car, muttering under his breath. The other cop in the car, who had been silent this entire time, started the engine without saying a word. Without another glance at Marcus or his family, the squad car sped off, disappearing down the road as quickly as it had come. Marcus stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. His legs felt weak beneath him, and the adrenaline was still coursing through his veins. He turned back to the car, his hands trembling as he opened the door. Ava was still sitting there, her phone in her lap, her eyes wide with shock. Eli, still confused, was rubbing his eyes in the back seat, not fully understanding the gravity of what had just happened. "Are you okay?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He wanted to scream, to rage, to tell the world how wrong this was, but all he could do was shake his head. It was over. But it wasn't over. He sat down in the car, the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed. He didn't know how to make sense of it. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his family. It was about something much bigger, something that needed to change. And he would be damned if he didn't fight for it. The squad car disappeared down the road, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The adrenaline still buzzed in his veins, and his mind replayed the moments over and over again. The sirens, the tension, the officer's hand on his gun, the fear in his children's eyes. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But he did wake up. This wasn't a dream. It was his reality. He glanced at Ava, who was staring at her phone, her fingers tapping nervously on the screen, as if to reassure herself that the footage was safe. Her wide eyes met his, and there was a silent understanding between them. The look said it all. They'd both seen something that couldn't be unseen, something that would follow them forever. Eli, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, can we go home now?" Marcus looked at his son, his heart aching. Eli had no idea what had just transpired, no idea why his father had shouted or why the police had been so aggressive. He was just a little boy, wanting to go home, to feel safe. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, buddy, we're going home." He started the car and pulled back onto the road, but as they drove, the silence between them grew heavy. Ava's eyes remained glued to her phone, replaying the video in small increments, making sure every second was recorded, every moment captured. She wasn't just documenting what happened, she was holding on to it, holding on to the proof that what had just happened to their family was real, something they couldn't let slip through the cracks. Marcus couldn't help but think about the officer's words. "You think you're some kind of big shot, huh?" What did that mean? Why had he been treated like a criminal in front of his own family simply because of his skin color? He'd had his papers checked countless times without incident. But this time it was different. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the long legacy of racial injustice and the fear that came with it. He knew that, for many, this was just another day. But for him, for his family, this was a wake-up call, and he wasn't going to ignore it. "Are you really okay?" Ava's voice broke through his thoughts. Her voice was soft, but he could hear the concern there. He didn't answer immediately. How could he? Was he really okay? How could he be when his children had just witnessed that? When his family had been put in danger just for being who they were? Just because of the color of his skin? No, he wasn't okay, but he would be. "I'll be okay," he finally said, his voice steady. "But we need to talk about what happened. We can't just forget about it." Ava nodded, her face serious. "I know, Dad. I won't forget. I won't let anyone forget." They drove in silence for a few more minutes, the weight of the situation still hanging in the air. Neither of them sure of what to do next. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this moment slide. He couldn't let it go unspoken. Not for himself, not for his family, and not for anyone who had ever faced this kind of injustice. As they turned into their driveway, the house standing in front of them, it felt almost surreal to be home, safe. But he knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The next step was clear. It wasn't just about fighting for his own peace of mind. It was about fighting for something bigger, something that needed to change, for all of them. And as the car came to a stop, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would make sure that this moment, this injustice, wouldn't be forgotten. that it would be the spark that ignited something bigger, something that needed to happen. Because change, he realized, wouldn't come unless they fought for it. And that fight, for the first time, felt personal. The house was quiet when they walked inside. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as Marcus closed the door behind him, his fingers lingering on the handle for a moment longer than usual. Ava and Eli went straight to the living room, but Marcus didn't follow them immediately. Instead, he stood in the hallway, looking out the window, his mind replaying every second of the encounter. The flash of blue lights, the officer's voice, the way his hand moved toward his gun, and the terror that gripped his chest when he saw the barrel pointed at his son. It was all too real. He couldn't shake it, couldn't let it go. It wasn't just about what happened in those few minutes. It was about everything that had led up to it, everything that had happened before, and everything that would follow. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Ava standing there, her phone still in her hand, but now it was off. Her face was solemn, her eyes tired but determined. She wasn't the same little girl he had driven around just a few hours ago. That girl had been carefree, unaware of the world's cruelties. Now she knew. "Dad," she began softly, "what are we going to do about this?" Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to steady himself. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay. He wanted to say it was just a misunderstanding, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was that the world was broken, and it didn't care about the papers you carried or the life you lived. It only saw what it wanted to see. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I do know one thing. We can't let it slide. We can't pretend it didn't happen. Because if we do, it'll keep happening. To us, to others, and that's not something we can accept." Ava nodded, a quiet strength in her gaze. "You're right. We can't let it go. We need to make sure people know. We need to show them what happened." Marcus felt a surge of pride. She was just a kid, but she understood. She got it. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that needed to change. He walked over to the couch where Eli was now sitting, playing with a toy, completely unaware of the storm that had passed through their lives. Marcus sat down beside him, his son's small hand slipping into his. He knew, deep down, that this was the moment. This was the turning point. It wasn't just about defending himself. It was about speaking for all the others who had been silenced, for every person who had faced injustice and had nowhere to turn. "We're going to take action," Marcus said, looking at both of his children. "We're going to make sure our voices are heard. We can't just let this go, but we'll do it the right way. We'll show them we won't back down." Ava took a seat next to him, her phone now turned on again, ready to help him take the next step. "What's the next move, Dad?" Marcus stood up, a new sense of purpose igniting within him. He walked over to the desk, pulled out his laptop, and began typing. He wasn't sure what exactly he was going to do, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to make sure that people saw this for what it really was. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the first step toward changing things, towards making sure no one else would have to live through what they had. He clicked on the upload button, and just like that, the video was out in the world. Ava's footage, the raw, unedited truth, was now in the hands of anyone willing to listen. "Let's see where this goes," he muttered under his breath, feeling both scared and hopeful at the same time. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't alone. The fight for justice had just begun. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a feeling he couldn't shake, a mix of fear and hope. He had done it. He had uploaded the video. But now the real test began. Would it make a difference? Would anyone even care? Or would it just get lost in the noise of social media, ignored by those who needed to hear it the most? Ava was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, her eyes glued to the screen. She had been checking the video's views, refreshing the page over and over again. Marcus walked over and glanced at the screen. It had been live for less than 12 hours, but the numbers were already climbing. Hundreds of people had watched, then thousands. Comments were pouring in, some supportive, others angry, questioning why this was even a story to begin with. But the outpouring of support was louder than the criticism. People were sharing the video, tagging others, and demanding answers. Marcus felt a weight lift off his chest. But the reality of what they were doing was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was a movement. And whether he was ready or not, he was now part of something bigger than himself. "How's it going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he sat down beside Ava. "I think it's going viral," she said, eyes wide. "It's everywhere. Look, even news outlets are starting to pick it up." Marcus stared at the screen. There at the top of the trending feed was the video of his encounter with the police. Headlines from local and national news outlets were starting to run with the story. "Police stop turns violent, a father's fight for justice, and caught on camera, another case of police brutality." For the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. But then the phone rang. It was an unknown number, and Marcus's stomach twisted with apprehension. He hesitated before picking it up, unsure of what he was about to hear. "Hello, Mr. Johnson?" a voice on the other end said. "This is Detective Andrews with the department. I'm calling about the video your daughter posted online." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect. He had already imagined the worst. The police department calling to intimidate him, to tell him to take the video down, or worse, accuse him of fabricating the whole thing. "Yes, this is Marcus Johnson," he replied, his voice calm but his mind racing. "What about the video?" "We've been instructed to look into the incident," Detective Andrews said, his voice formal. "There's an internal investigation underway, and we want to hear your side of the story. Could you come down to the station to discuss what happened?" Marcus felt a surge of both relief and anxiety. This wasn't what he had expected. They were actually taking it seriously. "Yes, I'll be there," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. He didn't know where this would lead, but he was ready. Ready to take the next step, no matter what. As he hung up the phone, he turned to Ava. "They want me to come in for a statement. An investigation is starting." Ava nodded, her eyes locked on his. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Marcus looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, it is." The drive to the police station felt surreal. Marcus sat in the driver's seat, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. This was it, the moment when everything could either start to change or it could all come crashing down. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew he had to face it head on. Ava was in the passenger seat, her phone still close, ready to document whatever happened next. It was no longer just about the encounter with that officer. It was about something bigger, something that would affect not just their family, but every other person who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. As they pulled into the parking lot of the station, Marcus took a deep breath. The building loomed in front of him, gray and imposing. He could see a couple of officers standing outside, talking in hushed voices. They didn't seem to notice him at first, but as he stepped out of the car, he felt their eyes on him. It was a strange feeling, being watched but not knowing whether it was with suspicion or sympathy. He walked into the station, Ava close behind him. The receptionist, a young woman, looked up at him and then back down at her desk, her face unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," she said, finally breaking the silence. "They're expecting you. Please follow me." They walked down a long corridor to a small room where Detective Andrews was waiting. He was sitting behind a desk, a stack of paperwork in front of him. When he saw Marcus and Ava enter, he stood up, extending his hand. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming in," he said, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "Please, have a seat." Marcus sat down, but Ava didn't sit. She stood beside him, her presence like a shield. She wasn't going anywhere. Not until this was all out in the open. The detective took a seat and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I've watched the video. We take these matters seriously, especially when it involves a member of the public, and especially when there's a child involved." Marcus nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. "I just want to make sure that what happened to me and my family doesn't happen to anyone else. I want this to be investigated thoroughly. No one should be treated the way we were." Detective Andrews didn't respond immediately. Instead, he flipped through the paperwork on his desk, his eyes scanning each page before he looked back at Marcus. "I agree," he said quietly. "But as you know, these things aren't always black and white. We have to follow the proper procedures. I'll make sure your statement is part of the investigation." Marcus's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. An investigation wasn't a guarantee that things would change. It was just the beginning of a long, uncertain process. You can't just sweep this under the rug, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'm not going to let that happen. Detective Andrews didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. I understand, and I'm not here to do that. We're going to look at everything. Your side, the officer's side, and the evidence. We'll make sure the truth comes out. The conversation continued, and as they spoke, Marcus realized something important. This wasn't just about the officer who had stopped him. This wasn't just about the fear he had felt that day, or the way his children had been scared for their lives. It was about something bigger, a system that needed to be held accountable. As they finished the conversation, Detective Andrews gave him a final look. We'll be in touch. We're starting the process. But remember, these things take time. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure how long he could hold on. Time had never felt more fragile, more uncertain. He left the station with Ava by his side, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. As they walked back to the car, Ava looked up at him. Do you think they'll do something about it? I don't know, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. But I do know one thing. We've started something, and we won't stop until it's right. The next few weeks felt like a blur. Marcus couldn't shake the constant pressure, the feeling that something monumental was unfolding, but he had no idea how it would end. The video had gone viral, and the media had picked it up like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and even local community groups were talking about it. People were sharing their own stories of similar experiences, stories that were both heartbreaking and enraging. Ava, who had become more determined than ever, spent her days working alongside her father. They attended rallies, met with local organizations, and spoke with journalists who wanted to know more about the incident. The phone calls kept coming in. Marcus had never imagined how one moment could transform his life. But here they were, fighting not just for justice for himself, but for every person who had been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. But despite the overwhelming support, the weight of it all started to take its toll. There were days when Marcus felt like he couldn't take another phone call, couldn't face another interview. He would go to bed exhausted, but the next day it would start all over again. And all the while the investigation continued. Marcus hadn't heard from Detective Andrews for a few days, but he knew that the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. It wasn't easy, trying to balance his fight for justice with the reality of his day-to-day life. He was still working his regular job, still trying to provide for his family. But every moment, every breath he took, felt like it was consumed by this ongoing battle. One evening, after a long day of interviews, Marcus came home to find Ava sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Hey, he said softly as he stepped inside. How's it going? Ava didn't look up immediately. She was scrolling through the comments on a post, and the look on her face made Marcus stop in his tracks. It wasn't the usual look of determination or hope. It was something darker. Is everything okay? Marcus asked, walking over to her. Ava closed the laptop slowly, her face a mixture of frustration and sadness. I don't know anymore, Dad. I'm getting messages from people. Some of them are supportive, but others, they're angry. They're calling us liars, saying we're making it up, that we're just trying to get attention. Marcus's heart sank. He had expected backlash, of course, but seeing Ava so upset, hearing the doubt in her voice made the weight of the situation feel unbearable. Sweetheart, he said gently, sitting down beside her, you can't let the hate get to you. There will always be people who won't believe, who want to tear us down because they can't understand the truth. But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change what we've experienced, and it doesn't change our fight for justice. Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she was trying to hold back. But what if they're right? What if we're just making this worse? What if we're just making everything harder for everyone? Marcus took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. No, Ava, we're not making it worse. We're making it better. We're showing people the truth, even when it's hard to face. And you can't let anyone take that away from you. You've done something incredible, something that many people will never have the courage to do. You've brought attention to a problem that needs to be solved. Ava wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. I know, but it's just hard. Every time we take a step forward, it feels like we're being pushed 2 steps back. Marcus nodded. I get it, but we keep moving forward no matter what. We don't let the hate win. We don't let the lies win. We keep fighting, and we keep speaking the truth because that's the only way things will ever change. Ava smiled weakly, her determination returning, albeit a little battered. I guess you're right. We can't stop now. No, Marcus said, his voice firm. We can't stop now. Not when we've come this far. As they sat together, the weight of their journey hanging over them, Marcus knew that this fight was far from over. It wasn't just about one video or one police officer. It was about a movement, a collective outcry for change. And though the road ahead seemed long and uncertain, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had already made waves, but the real work was just beginning. The following weeks were even harder. The public outcry over Marcus's encounter with the police officer seemed to grow louder, but so did the division. The hate-filled comments didn't stop. They kept pouring in, with more people attacking Marcus and his family for speaking out, for sharing their truth. But there were also countless voices in support, voices from all walks of life, from people who understood, from people who had suffered the same injustices. Still, the constant barrage of negativity began to chip away at Marcus. He found himself more exhausted than ever. The pressure of it all, the cameras, the interviews, the never-ending discussions, was taking its toll. He had thought that the fight would be simple, that it would be enough to just share their story. But the fight was bigger than that. It was personal, and it was complex. And it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about a whole system that needed to change. One evening, after another long day of speaking with reporters, Marcus sat down on the couch, his body heavy with fatigue. Ava was sitting next to him, scrolling through her phone as usual. Her expression was a mix of determination and exhaustion, just like his own. They hadn't talked much today. They were both too tired, too overwhelmed to say anything meaningful. The silence between them felt deafening. Finally, Ava spoke, breaking the stillness. Dad, she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. I'm not sure I can keep doing this. It feels like we're just fighting for a change that won't ever come. I don't know how much more I can take. Marcus looked at her, his heart aching. She was right. This battle wasn't easy, and sometimes it felt like the weight of it would crush them both. The emotional toll was wearing them down, but Marcus knew that they couldn't stop. They had to keep pushing forward even when it felt impossible. I know, sweetheart, he said softly. I know it feels like we're fighting against something that's too big, something we can't change. But we are changing things, one person at a time, one step at a time. It's hard. Hell, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's worth it. Ava turned to look at him, her eyes tired but steady. But what if it's not enough? What if we don't get justice? What if things just stay the same? Marcus took a deep breath, thinking about the long road ahead. He thought about the countless people who had been in their shoes, who had fought for change and never seen the fruits of their labor. But he also thought about the people who had pushed through, who had fought for justice even when it seemed impossible. He thought about his own mother, who had taught him to never give up, no matter the odds. We may not get the justice we want right away, Marcus said, his voice firm, but we will get change. It might take longer than we want. It might take years, but we won't give up. We can't, because if we stop now, then all of this, all the pain and all the suffering will have been for nothing. Ava took a moment to process his words. She nodded slowly, her gaze softening. I get it, but I don't want us to burn out. I don't want this fight to destroy us. We have to find a way to keep going without losing ourselves. Marcus smiled at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. We will. Together. We'll keep fighting, but we'll do it in a way that keeps us whole. We won't let this take everything from us. We'll find balance. We'll find strength in each other, and we'll never stop fighting for what's right. Ava smiled back, a small but genuine smile. Okay. We'll keep going. For the right reasons? Later that night, Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The world seemed so still, so quiet, but inside everything felt so turbulent. He thought about what Ava had said, about not wanting the fight to destroy them. He understood her fear, but he also knew they couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when they had come so far. In the distance, he could see the lights of the city twinkling. It was a reminder that, no matter how tough things got, there was still hope. There was still a chance to make a difference, to push for the change that was so desperately needed. And no matter how long it took, he would keep fighting, not just for his family, but for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following weeks were difficult, but Marcus and Ava continued their journey. The fight was not easy, and at times they felt like they were fighting an unconquerable storm. But whenever they thought about the people who had supported them, who had stood with them for justice, they found the strength to continue. Marcus knew that this fight was not just his. It was the fight of everyone who had been silenced, of everyone who had been forgotten in the shadows. And he believed that, although the road ahead was long and arduous, they would never be alone. One day, after receiving a call from the police about the results of the investigation, Marcus stood in front of the mirror and looked into his own eyes. They had come a long way, and whether or not they achieved immediate change, this fight would never be forgotten. That was Marcus's promise, and it was a promise he made to his family, to the people he loved, and to all those fighting for justice. And when he looked into his daughter's eyes, he knew that this journey would continue, not just for them, but for everything they represented, the hope, the resilience, and the belief in a better world. Thank you for following this story to the end. If you felt Marcus and Ava's story touch your heart, please leave your comments below the video. This story is the truth we need to face, and together, we can make a change. If you want to continue following stories of resilience and fighting for justice, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. We will continue this journey together. Please leave a share so we can spread this story to those who need to hear it most. Thank you for your support.